The airport buzzed with its usual controlled chaos, voices merging into a low hum, wheels skimming across polished floors, announcements echoing overhead. Amid the flow of travelers, Imani Clarke stood patiently in line at the airline's service counter, her small leather carry-on resting beside her feet, her posture still and poised. Dressed in a tailored charcoal coat over a soft gray blouse and slacks, her natural curls pulled into a neat bun, she exuded the quiet confidence of a woman used to being overlooked and refusing to shrink. Her presence was composed, not commanding, deliberate, not demanding. But that was often misunderstood. As the line crept forward, Imani glanced at her watch. An hour before her flight to San Francisco began boarding. Plenty of time to ask a simple question. When it was finally her turn, she stepped up to the counter with a soft, professional smile. "Good morning," she said, her voice calm and respectful. "I was wondering if there are any first-class upgrades available for Flight 227? The two employees behind the counter barely acknowledged her. The young woman on the left, whose name tag read Brittany, continued chewing gum as she scrolled through a screen. Her nails, long and candy pink, clicked obnoxiously on the keys. Beside her, a young man named Ethan adjusted his tie with a theatrical sigh, giving Imani a long once-over. "First class, huh?" Brittany finally muttered, glancing at Ethan with a smirk. "That's bold." Imani blinked once, her smile fading slightly. "I've already purchased a ticket. I just wanted to see if upgrades were available." Ethan leaned forward on the counter, one eyebrow raised in mock amusement. "You sure about that, ma'am? First class isn't just extra legroom, you know. That seat comes with a price tag." The tone wasn't just condescending, it was layered with implication, heavy with the kind of subtle mockery that didn't have to be explicit to be insulting. Imani kept her expression neutral, though her heart gave a familiar twinge. She'd lived through this before, too many times, in offices, in boutiques, at restaurants. That moment when someone looked at her brown skin, her quiet confidence, her refusal to flaunt wealth, and decided she didn't belong. "I'm aware of the cost," she replied, her voice unwavering. "I'm only asking about availability." Brittany stifled a laugh, whispering something to Ethan with an exaggerated tilt of her head, not even pretending to hide the smirk curling at the corners of her mouth. "People really be trying it today," she muttered. "Always reaching." Ethan chuckled. "Gotta admire the hustle, though." Then he looked back at Imani, his eyes filled with false courtesy. "I mean, I can check, but let's be honest, it's probably a little out of range." The words dropped like stones in the space between them. Imani felt her fingers curl slightly around the handle of her carry-on, the only outward sign of the heat rising in her chest. Out of range. Reaching. Trying it. They weren't just comments. They were judgments wrapped in sarcasm, designed to belittle, to reduce, to define her by their assumptions. And those assumptions were always the same. Imani was too used to this to react impulsively. She had spent years learning not to give people like this a show, not the anger they expected, not the outbursts they could use to dismiss her as overreacting. She inhaled slowly, eyes locked on Ethan's smug grin, her voice steady as ever. "I didn't ask for your opinion," she said, each syllable quiet but sharp. "I asked if there were any upgrades available." Ethan blinked. Just for a moment, the mask cracked. But Brittany recovered fast, laughing under her breath, her eyes scanning Imani like she was daring her to say more. "I mean, do you even have status?" she asked, her voice dripping with insincerity. "We usually reserve upgrades for elite flyers, our regulars." The implication was clear. Imani wasn't their kind of regular. Behind her, a few passengers began shifting uneasily in line. A woman with graying hair glanced up from her phone, frowning slightly. A tall man in a business suit looked from Imani to the counter, his lips pressed into a thin, unreadable line. Imani noticed them, but she didn't need their validation. What hurt wasn't that strangers had witnessed the scene. What hurt was the predictability of it, the constant battle to be seen, to be heard without having to shout, to be respected without having to prove worth first. And somehow it always started with the same look. That quick scan of her face, her skin, her clothes. That smug calculation. She can't possibly belong here. Imani had built companies. She had led boardrooms. She had mentored rising stars and sat at tables many thought she'd never reach. And yet, here she was, still questioned, still diminished, still mocked at a service desk by two employees who thought a tailored coat and quiet grace meant less than. It never mattered how many awards sat on her shelves or how many zeros lined her bank account. In moments like this, she was still just another you people, and the exhaustion of that reality settled on her chest like a familiar weight. But this time, she wasn't going to let it slide. Not because she needed to prove anything to Brittany or Ethan, but because the little girl standing 4 passengers behind her, wide-eyed and watching, deserved to see what quiet strength looked like. She deserved to know that disrespect, when met with dignity, does not go unanswered. Not anymore. At first, it was just the tone, the kind that's hard to explain if you haven't lived through it. Not loud, not obvious, but sharp, slicing beneath the surface of politeness like a hidden blade. Imani Clarke heard it immediately, even before the words fully landed. She had asked a simple question, one she'd posed dozens of times before on flights across continents, in cities from Paris to Portland. Are there any first-class upgrades available? But Brittany's response wasn't the warm efficiency one might expect from someone trained in customer service. It was a smirk, a scoff barely hidden beneath gum-popping lips. And Ethan, with his poorly concealed arrogance, had leaned forward and looked her up and down like she was a toddler reaching for something on the top shelf. "You sure about that, ma'am?" he asked, each syllable dipped in a syrupy mockery that dared her to take offense. "First class isn't just a few extra inches of legroom, you know. It's premium." The last word hung in the air like perfume that had turned sour. Imani felt her spine stiffen, but she kept her expression calm, her voice level. "Yes, I'm aware." She'd learned the lesson early in life. Never flinch when they're trying to put you in your place. But what followed was not just rudeness. It was the unraveling of a deeper, more familiar pattern. One that many Black women recognize with painful clarity. The dismissive glance. The shared, smug look between two employees who thought they knew her story before she opened her mouth. The forced sweetness in their voices masking something uglier underneath. "Let me guess," Brittany said with a half laugh, typing without looking at her screen. "You're hoping there's a last-minute deal or something?" She looked at Ethan, who nodded in mock seriousness. "Maybe she's got, like, points saved up." "Or maybe," Ethan added, his voice just low enough to pretend it was a joke, "someone's gonna surprise her with a little fairy tale upgrade. You know, Prince Charming and all that." Imani's lips parted slightly, not in surprise, in quiet disbelief. In the surreal moment of watching two grown adults degrade a stranger to her face under the guise of harmless banter. Behind her, the line of passengers had started to notice. She could feel it, eyes lifting from phones, postures straightening. But that didn't matter right now, because what was happening in front of her wasn't new. It wasn't shocking, it was exhausting. "You people." Brittany hadn't said the words yet, but they were there, echoing unspoken in her tone, her expression, her posture. The idea that Imani, a Black woman standing calmly in front of them, didn't just not belong in first class. She didn't even deserve to ask. The microaggressions were falling like raindrops now, too small to scream about, too frequent to ignore. "We just like to be realistic with folks," Brittany continued, her voice laced with saccharine condescension. "So nobody ends up disappointed, you know?" She flashed a fake smile, especially when it's not really in the budget. Imani's heart thudded once, hard, but she didn't let it show. She had spent her entire life training for moments like this, where control of her body, her breath, her tone, was not just professionalism, but survival. Because the second she raised her voice or called out the prejudice plainly, she would become the problem, not them. Her composure would be labeled aggressive, her dignity rewritten as attitude. And yet, as they smirked and snickered behind the desk, assuming she was just another woman asking for something too big for her hands to hold, Imani felt something shift inside her. It wasn't anger, it was something deeper. A sorrow laced with fire. A grief for every time she'd been diminished, dismissed, or doubted before a single question was answered. For every time her presence had been treated like an intrusion. For every woman like her who had learned to keep receipts, remain calm, and carry the invisible armor of self-worth into spaces that insisted she didn't belong. "You people always reach too far." That's what Brittany finally muttered, her voice low but pointed, like she thought Imani couldn't hear. And that was it. The mask slipped. The words weren't just veiled anymore. They were laid bare. The assumption that she couldn't possibly afford what she was asking for. That she wasn't one of those people who flew in first class. That she was trying to take up space that didn't belong to her. But that's the cruelty of microaggressions. They want to stay just small enough to make you doubt yourself. Just subtle enough that if you push back, they can say you're overreacting. That it was just a joke, just a tone, just a misunderstanding, just. Imani's fingers tensed around her carry-on handle, her jaw locked, but her eyes remained steady, burning not with rage, but with the quiet, searing heat of someone who has had enough. She looked Ethan in the eye, then Brittany. "I didn't ask for your commentary," she said, her voice low and clear. "I asked about seat availability." But her voice, steady, composed, was sharper than any outburst. And they felt it. A flicker of uncertainty passed across Brittany's face. Ethan shifted his weight behind the counter. Because that's the other thing about quiet strength. It's unnerving. They had expected passivity. Or a meltdown. Not this, not her. But still, they didn't take her seriously. Not yet. They thought they knew her. Just another woman asking for more than she was worth. What they didn't know was that Imani Clarke was worth more than every seat in first class combined. What they didn't know was that in less than 10 minutes, their smug little kingdom behind that counter would come crumbling down. Because Imani wasn't just a passenger. She wasn't just a woman with a question. She was the storm they didn't see coming. And what happened next, what she did next, would leave the entire terminal stunned, their assumptions shattered, and both of them jobless before the hour was over. Stay with me, because the moment that phone left her pocket, everything changed. And when the truth of who Imani really was finally landed, it hit harder than turbulence at 30,000 feet. Imani Clarke stood still, her body perfectly composed, even as the sting of humiliation burned hot beneath her skin. The smirks on Brittany and Ethan's faces had not faded. They were growing bolder, more emboldened by the lack of consequence. Their whispers, laced with derision, carried just enough volume to let the people in line behind her know that the joke was Imani. That her request for a first-class upgrade had been laughable. That her very presence at the counter had been a kind of intrusion. But still, she said nothing. Not yet. She kept her breath steady and her voice silent, holding every bit of fury behind the calm of her eyes. And then, just as she reached for her phone, a small voice caught her attention. A child's voice. "Mama, why are they laughing at the lady?" Imani's eyes flicked to the left. Near the edge of the line stood a black woman, holding the hand of a young girl, no older than 5, her soft brown eyes wide with confusion and quiet concern. The girl was looking at Imani, not with pity, but with the open, honest curiosity of a child witnessing something she didn't yet understand. The mother bent low, whispered something in the girl's ear, trying to pull her attention away. But it was too late. Imani had seen her, and the girl had seen everything. That was the moment the hurt turned into something else. Not just sorrow or anger, but responsibility. Because now there was a witness who mattered. Someone young and watching, learning, forming her understanding of the world. Imani had once been that girl, clutching her mother's hand in airports and waiting rooms, watching the way women like her were treated and how they responded. This wasn't just about Brittany and Ethan anymore. It was about what came next. What kind of example would be left behind? Imani's fingers moved with measured grace as she pulled her phone from her coat pocket and tapped the screen. The movement was so smooth, so quiet, that Brittany didn't even look up. Ethan, half lounging against the desk, chuckled to himself. "Gonna make a call now?" he muttered. "What's next, a letter to Santa?" Brittany giggled behind her gum. "Maybe she's phoning a friend. See if she can borrow some miles." Their cruelty was effortless, practiced. But Imani didn't flinch. She didn't even acknowledge the mockery. She brought the phone to her ear and spoke with crisp, quiet authority. "Hi, it's Imani Clarke. I'm at Terminal B, Gate 14 at the service counter. Could you please send Mr. Alvarez down right away? We have a personnel issue." The words were simple, but her tone carried the weight of command. The pause on the other end was brief. "Understood. He's on his way." Imani ended the call and slipped the phone back into her coat pocket with the same quiet precision. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't announce her title. She didn't scream. She simply stepped back from the counter and waited. That was all. And yet the entire energy of the terminal began to shift. Slowly, quietly, the line grew more still. The whispers behind her changed tone, from mockery to curiosity, from amusement to unease. Brittany noticed first. She glanced up, suddenly uncertain. "Who did you say you called?" she asked, voice tinged with something close to nervousness. Imani didn't answer. She didn't need to. The silence was part of the lesson. Ethan tried to brush it off with a laugh, but it came out too forced, too high. "She's bluffing," he muttered to Brittany, but he didn't sound convinced. "Nobody's coming." And still Imani waited. Her posture was effortless, but her presence now felt like a weight in the room, a stillness no one could ignore. A quiet reminder that dignity, when held long enough, becomes power. The mother and daughter were still watching. The girl's eyes hadn't left Imani, and now the mother, who had first tried to hush the moment, gave Imani a nod, not of pity, but of recognition, of respect. 10 minutes passed like water boiling under a sealed lid. You couldn't hear the pressure building, but it was there. And then the sound of hard, confident steps broke through the stillness. Polished shoes against airport tile. A sharp navy suit cutting through the crowd. Mr. Alvarez, the regional manager, arrived like a gavel in a courtroom. He didn't glance at Brittany or Ethan. He went straight to Imani. "Ms. Clarke," he said, his tone formal but respectful. "I came as soon as I got your call. My deepest apologies for the delay. What happened here is completely unacceptable." The moment hit the room like a dropped pin in a church. Brittany's jaw fell open. Ethan took a full step back. And in that instant, everything they had assumed about Imani crumbled. The woman they had mocked, the woman they had dismissed as a joke, she had the regional manager on speed dial. She didn't shout because she didn't need to. Her silence was never weakness. It was discipline. And now the reckoning had arrived. Imani met Mr. Alvarez's eyes calmly. "These two employees," she said, gesturing toward Brittany and Ethan without even turning to face them, "violated every standard of basic professionalism and courtesy. They not only mocked a customer, they made racial and class-based assumptions. That is not just disappointing, it is dangerous." Mr. Alvarez nodded solemnly. "Consider it handled." And it was. Within moments, both employees were removed from the counter. Not just corrected, removed. Passengers watched, stunned. Some nodded. Some clapped, quietly. But Imani didn't linger to bask in it. She simply turned back toward the young girl in the line, gave her the softest smile, and walked away. Because sometimes the loudest power is the kind that doesn't need to raise its voice. And what happened next? You'll want to hear it. Because this story wasn't just about justice, it was about legacy. The minutes crawled by with excruciating slowness, each second stretching longer than the last, thick with the weight of anticipation and something even heavier. Shame. Not Imani's shame, she had none. But the quiet kind that begins to seep into a room when people start to realize something is wrong, that the laughter they once thought harmless now feels out of place, misaligned with the stillness of the woman who stood calmly at the center of it all. Imani Clarke didn't shift, didn't fidget, didn't glance at her phone or her watch. She simply stood there, hands resting gently on the handle of her carry-on, her back straight, her gaze fixed forward. Not at Brittany, not at Ethan, but at nothing in particular, like someone who had already decided the outcome and was only waiting for the world to catch up. It was her stillness that disturbed them most, because it wasn't the stillness of uncertainty, it was the stillness of certainty. The kind that unnerves those who know, deep down, they've made a mistake and are just beginning to realize how large that mistake might be. Brittany, once so comfortable behind her veil of passive-aggressive sarcasm, was suddenly all motion, adjusting her name tag, reapplying her lip gloss, glancing toward the terminal entrance. She wasn't laughing anymore. Ethan, once smug and dismissive, now tapped nervously at the keyboard, pretending to work as though the sound of clicking could drown out the shift in energy that was swallowing the air around them. The tension wasn't loud, it was quiet, too quiet, like the moment before a verdict, or the held breath before a storm. And yet, Imani remained motionless, her silence far more powerful than any outburst could have been. Passengers were watching now, openly. Some trying not to appear too obvious, others not bothering to hide their curiosity. A woman in her 70s with neatly styled gray hair stared directly at Brittany, her lips pressed in disapproval. A teenage boy tugged on his father's sleeve, whispering something before the father shook his head and muttered, "Just wait." Another man, well-dressed and middle-aged, stood with arms folded, watching the scene like he was taking mental notes. The air around the counter had thickened. It no longer felt like a customer service interaction. It felt like a courtroom. And in the center of it all, Imani was the quiet judge, the gravity pulling every eye toward her, whether they understood why or not. She didn't need to raise her voice. That's what made it so powerful. She didn't argue. She didn't defend. She didn't explain her worth or her intent. She simply stood, unmoving, unbothered, unfolding the truth of who she was without ever saying a word. And that silence did what outrage could not. It revealed the ugliness of Brittany and Ethan's behavior for what it was. Without contrast, cruelty hides. But when met with grace, it becomes undeniable. And now the cruelty, the mockery, the arrogance, it was beginning to rot in the light of that stillness. Brittany tried to recover. "It's not a big deal," she muttered, though no one had asked. People ask dumb questions all the time. But even as she spoke, her voice lacked conviction. She knew what everyone else could now see clearly. This woman was not dumb, and the question had never been the problem. Ethan followed with a weak chuckle, saying something about having a long day, but the words hung awkwardly in the air, rejected by the silence they were meant to fill. Imani didn't flinch. She didn't acknowledge the words or the desperation behind them. She only blinked once, slowly, as if even that act of movement was measured. It wasn't just what she was doing, it was what she wasn't doing. She wasn't giving them the satisfaction of retreat. She wasn't explaining herself to make them feel more comfortable. She wasn't folding her power to ease their guilt. And that made the silence unbearable. To those who had relied on mockery to mask their own smallness, her quiet became a mirror. And they didn't like what they saw in it. The minutes dragged, and still she waited, and the tension twisted tighter. Somewhere nearby, a child began to cry, bored of the wait, hungry, tired, but even that sound couldn't break the charged quiet. A security officer who had wandered near the gate paused to glance toward the counter, sensing something unspoken but unmistakable. When Imani gently nodded to him, his posture straightened just a bit, as if even he understood that something was about to happen, something important. Ethan whispered, "She's bluffing," to Brittany, though even he didn't seem to believe it anymore. Brittany nodded too quickly, licking her lips nervously. If she really knew someone important, they'd be here by now. Imani said nothing. Her eyes flicked once, only once, toward the entrance to the terminal, and then back forward. That was all. But even that motion made the air change again, as if her glance had summoned something inevitable. And then it happened. A hush fell like a curtain dropping, and the sound of leather shoes striking tile echoed through the terminal. Precise, intentional, coming closer. People turned. A man in a deep navy suit strode through the crowd, his expression tight, his presence cutting through the fog like a lighthouse through mist. Mr. Alvarez, the regional director. No clipboard, no hesitation. Just a man walking like he already knew the whole story and was there to finish it. The crowd parted. Ethan's hand fell away from the keyboard. Brittany stepped back from the counter. Imani didn't move. She didn't need to, because the moment Mr. Alvarez stopped in front of her and addressed her with crisp, reverent respect, "Ms. Clarke, thank you for your patience. I came immediately." The world remembered something it had forgotten. Dignity does not beg. Respect does not shout. And power, real power, often waits in silence. Stay with me, because what Imani said next and what happened to Brittany and Ethan after that would send ripples far beyond that terminal. This wasn't just a reckoning. It was a reset. 10 minutes. That's all it took for everything to change. But for Brittany and Ethan, those 10 minutes stretched into a lifetime of slow, creeping dread, the kind that coils in your stomach when the weight of your own arrogance begins to settle in. Imani Clarke hadn't moved from her place near the counter. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't argued, hadn't so much as rolled her eyes. And yet somehow the energy in the terminal had shifted entirely around her. It had started with whispers, then stillness, then stares. Not at Imani, but at Brittany and Ethan. Something unspoken was forming in the air, the way pressure builds before a thunderstorm. And then the sound came, the unmistakable, deliberate rhythm of polished shoes on tile, each step cutting through the silence like a metronome of reckoning. Brittany looked up first, and her smirk flickered, just for a moment, before she turned quickly back to her screen, typing nothing with fake focus. Ethan's fingers froze mid-tap, his eyes tracking the movement, now slicing its way through the terminal crowd. The man approaching was tall, composed, dressed in an impeccably tailored navy blue suit that said everything his face hadn't yet revealed. His name badge shimmered slightly beneath his lapel. D. Alvarez, Regional Director. But it wasn't the suit that made the air go cold. It was the way he walked, not with bluster, not with case, but with certainty, like someone who had heard everything, already made up his mind, and had come not to ask questions, but to issue verdicts. Imani didn't move. She didn't even blink. But the moment Mr. Alvarez's eyes found hers, something in his posture shifted, his spine straighter, his jaw tight, his expression lined with respect. "Ms. Clarke," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent terminal, "I came as quickly as I could. Please accept my apologies for what you've experienced here today." The gasp that escaped Brittany's lips was quiet but sharp, like the last balloon at a party popping long after the fun had ended. Ethan's mouth dropped open, then closed again, as if trying to reset itself before anyone noticed. But everyone had noticed, because in that moment, every person in that terminal saw the truth unravel all at once. The woman they had mocked, dismissed, laughed at, called you people. That woman wasn't just a customer. She wasn't just someone. She was the someone. The one who had the regional director's direct line. The one who didn't need to explain herself. The one they should have shown respect to in the first place. And now it was too late. The damage was done. Imani turned to Mr. Alvarez with the slightest nod, the kind that didn't demand attention but somehow pulled every eye toward her. "Thank you for coming," she said softly, her voice composed but firm. "There's a situation here that goes beyond bad service. It speaks to culture, to assumptions, and to what this brand tolerates at its front line." She didn't raise her tone, but her words landed like bricks. Solid, unmovable, final. Brittany took a desperate step forward, her voice trembling as she tried to salvage what couldn't be saved. "Ms. Clarke, I didn't know. We didn't know who you were." Imani turned her gaze slowly toward her, and it wasn't anger in her eyes. It was disappointment, and somehow that was worse. "You didn't ask who I was," Imani replied evenly. "You assumed. You performed your bias out loud. You chose mockery over service. And the only thing that's surprising you now is that you guessed wrong." Ethan jumped in, stammering, "Look, it wasn't meant personally. We just thought—" "You thought wrong," Mr. Alvarez said, stepping forward now, his face etched with displeasure. "And from what I've just witnessed, neither of you should be representing this company. You embarrassed a passenger. You violated multiple standards of professionalism. And you've created a situation that reflects not just on yourselves, but on all of us." His voice hardened. "Gather your things. Effective immediately, your employment with this airline is terminated." It was quiet chaos that followed, not loud, not dramatic. Just the sound of two people realizing that their laughter had cost them everything. Brittany's hand flew to her mouth. Ethan's face flushed red, eyes darting toward the watching crowd, desperate for escape, but there was none. A uniformed airport supervisor appeared at Mr. Alvarez's gesture, and with polite firmness began guiding them away from the desk. Imani didn't turn to watch them leave. She wasn't here for spectacle. Her message had already been delivered, not just to them, but to everyone who had watched it unfold. She turned instead to Mr. Alvarez, her voice calm but lined with a quiet fatigue. "Now, about my seat upgrade," she said with the faintest smile. Mr. Alvarez gave a slight bow of his head. "Of course, Ms. Clarke. You'll be seated in 1A. We'll make sure your flight is peaceful, comfortable, and respectful." As she followed him toward the gate, a gentle wave of applause rose from the passengers nearby. It wasn't raucous, it wasn't performative. It was quiet, earnest, a signal that they had seen, and they understood, and they respected her, not because of her title, but because of how she carried herself when she had every reason to break. Imani's heels clicked against the tile like punctuation marks. Every step away from the counter echoed not just her dignity, but her message. That respect is not optional, that assumptions can have consequences, and that silence, when chosen, can be the most powerful response of all. The mother with the young daughter caught her eye as she passed. The child smiled, starstruck, and Imani gave a soft nod in return. Because that moment, that young girl watching, was the reason she hadn't raised her voice, the reason she hadn't lashed out. Because she wasn't just standing for herself. She was standing for every woman who'd been told she didn't belong. Until the moment they realized she did. And what came next? That's the part you won't want to miss. Because when Imani took her seat in first class, it wasn't just a seat, it was a statement. And the next move she made, well, let's just say it would change far more than one flight. It would change everything. It happened in a breath, so swift and clean it was almost surgical. One moment, Brittany and Ethan were clinging to the last threads of their arrogance, trying to laugh off what had become an unbearable silence. The next, those threads snapped. Imani Clarke turned to Mr. Alvarez with the same composed presence she'd maintained from the very beginning, graceful, measured, but suddenly carrying a gravity that shifted the air around her. They can explain themselves to I, she said quietly, her voice like still water just before it freezes. As of now, their employment with this airline is terminated. For a moment, no one moved. The entire terminal seemed to lean inward. The words were soft, but the power behind them was undeniable. Brittany gasped audibly, her hand flying to her chest as if she'd been struck. "Wait, you can't," she started, but her voice broke before she could finish. Ethan's face had gone pale, his mouth opening and closing, desperately searching for the right words. Some excuse, some shield, anything. "She can," Mr. Alvarez said flatly, cutting through the moment with executive finality. And she just did. His tone offered no escape, no second chance, no negotiations. And with that, the reality dropped. Hard. Imani wasn't just a woman they had disrespected. She was a senior partner on the airline's executive oversight committee, a key stakeholder, a woman who sat on the board of directors. And now their humiliation was complete. Security had already appeared, not because Imani called for it, but because the situation had clearly escalated into professional misconduct. Brittany stumbled back from the desk, her eyes filling with disbelief and then panic. "I didn't know," she whispered to no one in particular, as though saying it aloud might undo what she'd done. But there was no undoing it. Imani's face remained calm, unreadable. She didn't gloat, she didn't smirk. Her power wasn't theatrical, it was earned. Ethan, red-faced and trembling now, tried one last plea, reaching toward Mr. Alvarez. "This was just a misunderstanding. We didn't mean it like that. She's overreacting." That word, overreacting. Imani blinked once, just once, and her expression sharpened, but her voice remained steady. "You mocked me," she said, her tone more surgical than scolding. "You laughed at me. You whispered about me like I wasn't standing in front of you. And you did it all because of what you assumed. That is not a misunderstanding. That is a decision. You decided who I was before I had said more than 10 words." Ethan's shoulders sank. There was no coming back from that. The two employees were escorted away, not with shouting, not with handcuffs, not with chaos, but with the quiet devastation of people who had built their confidence on cruelty and had watched it collapse in front of witnesses. The murmurs among the passengers had swelled now, not in outrage, but in awe. Imani's poise hadn't just silenced a room. It had held a mirror to it, and everyone watching had seen the reflection. A few clapped, a few nodded respectfully. But most simply watched her. Not like a woman who'd won something, but like a woman who had carried something heavy and set it down without losing her balance. As Brittany and Ethan disappeared down the terminal hallway, Imani turned slightly, exhaling a breath she didn't even realize she'd been holding. Not out of relief, but from the ache of what it had cost her to stand that still. Because the truth was, this wasn't victory. Not really. She didn't want people fired. She didn't walk through life waiting to wield her power like a sword, but when forced, she used it precisely, firmly, and without apology. That's what it meant to survive in rooms that tried to shrink you. That's what it meant to lead with grace in spaces that still didn't understand the difference between politeness and respect. Mr. Alvarez turned to her, his voice softer now. Miss Clarke, I'm so sorry this happened. I had no idea. Imani held up a hand gently, stopping him. I don't need apologies, she said, her voice like silk drawn tight. I need accountability. I need to know that the next woman who doesn't have my title or my access won't be treated like this. Her eyes didn't waver, and in them, Mr. Alvarez saw the full measure of a woman who had endured this not once, but over and over again. His shoulders sank. Understood, he said quietly. We'll revisit the training policies today. HR will follow through. This won't be swept aside. Imani nodded once. Then, as if the storm had passed, she picked up her carry-on with the same quiet elegance she'd walked in with and made her way to the gate. Her upgrade was already processed, seat 1A. But this moment wasn't about a seat. It never had been. It was about the ground she'd just reclaimed, the lesson she'd just delivered, the young woman who'd seen her strength and would remember it, the man in the gray suit who had stood nearby in silent solidarity. The other black passengers who saw their own experiences reflected in hers and felt, if only for a moment, vindicated. And the passengers who had never considered what these moments cost, who now would. As she reached the jet bridge, the weight began to settle into her bones. Not the weight of the moment itself, but the weight of having to carry it so gracefully. Again, she didn't want to be feared. She didn't want to wield termination like a gavel. But she also didn't want to be mocked in public because her presence didn't fit someone's biased idea of belonging. So she did what she had to do, and she did it without raising her voice. Because power, real power, is not loud. It is not showy. It does not scream for attention. It walks in quietly, stands tall, and lets the world rearrange itself around it. And what comes next? That's what makes this story unforgettable. Because Imani's seat on that plane was just the beginning. What she wrote in her journal that night, what she did with the attention that followed, would ripple far beyond the gate. Stay with me. You'll want to see what justice looks like when it's dressed in quiet, beautiful strength. The moment Imani Clarke stepped into the first-class cabin, a hush fell over her, not the silence of absence, but the kind that follows thunder. The low hum of the aircraft, the soft lighting, the muted clinks of crystal and silver. It all felt a world away from the storm she had just walked through in the terminal. But the storm wasn't gone. It lived in her muscles, in the way her shoulders ached from being held so straight for so long. It lived in the invisible armor she wore, the one forged from decades of experience, the kind that deflects insults but never absorbs the blow. The flight attendant greeted her with a warmth that felt almost too kind, too perfect. Welcome aboard, Ms. Clarke. We're honored to have you. May I show you to your seat? She nodded, saying little, her voice too full of restrained emotion to speak without it trembling. She followed the attendant down the aisle past plush leather seats that offered comfort but no protection from what had already happened. Seat 1A, a window seat, first class, quiet, private, luxurious. It should have felt like a victory, but instead, as Imani sank into the wide leather cushion and placed her carry-on in the compartment above, it felt like a burden. A beautiful one, but a burden nonetheless, because she hadn't fought for a seat. She had fought once again for her dignity, for basic respect, for the right to stand at a counter and not be mocked, for the right to exist in a space without being reduced by assumptions. She reclined slightly, exhaling the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding since the moment she first asked about the upgrade. And in that breath was exhaustion, not from travel, but from being forced to carry herself perfectly through yet another moment where she'd been mistaken for less. It wasn't their firing that made her heavy. It was what had led to it. The fact that she had to call in her title like a shield, that she had to weaponize her connections, her proximity to power, just to be treated with basic decency. There was no triumph in that, only quiet ache. And beneath that ache, grief. Because she knew what so many didn't, that her ability to defend herself came from privilege she had fought tooth and nail to build. But what about the woman who came after her? The one without a direct line to a regional director? The one without a title or platform, or someone who would take her call? What would have happened to her? She thought of that woman. She thought of the child in line who had watched the whole thing with wondering eyes. She thought of the subtle shift in the crowd's silence. The moment people started to realize that something wasn't right. And yet, none of them had spoken up, only watched. And that too was its own quiet pain. Not that they hadn't stood beside her, but that they didn't know how. Imani reached for her journal, the worn leather-bound one that lived in her bag like a secret companion. She opened it to a fresh page and stared at the blankness, her pen hovering. Her fingers trembled slightly as the plane taxied across the runway. She steadied them, then began to write. Another gate, another test. I didn't fail, but I'm tired. She paused, the ink glistening on the page. The words came slowly with the weight of truth behind them. They weren't just mocking me. They were mocking what they thought I represented. A woman asking for too much. A black woman daring to ask it all. They thought they knew me, and they dismissed me. Not for what I said, but for how I looked when I said it. She could feel the sting rising behind her eyes, but she blinked it back. She wouldn't cry, not because she didn't need to, but because she'd trained herself to compartmentalize the pain, to put it away neatly, so she could carry on, so she could be what the world demanded of her, composed, competent, unshaken. The flight attendant returned, setting a glass of sparkling water gently on her tray. Ms. Clarke, if there's anything you need, please let us know. Imani looked up, meeting her eyes. For a brief second, there was something real there. Not scripted hospitality, but human understanding. She offered a small, sincere nod. Thank you, she said, voice soft. So, the attendant moved in, leaving Imani with her thoughts, her journal, and the hum of the jet beginning to climb toward altitude. Outside the window, the earth shrank as they lifted, the world below reduced to dots and lines. There was something comforting in that, the perspective of distance. But even as the plane soared, Imani remained grounded in the moment she had just left. She thought of Brittany and Ethan, of their faces when the truth landed. Not smug anymore. Just stunned, small, unmasked. She didn't hate them. She didn't even want revenge. What she wanted, what she always wanted, was for people like them to see the harm they caused and change Vatum. She wanted them to sit in the discomfort of being wrong. She wanted the echo of this moment to follow them. Not as shame, but as awakening. She didn't know if it would. She'd seen too many apologies ring hollow, too many lessons go unlearned. But maybe, this one would be different. Her phone buzzed quietly, a message from her assistant. HR confirmed both terminations. Multiple passengers left positive comments about how you handled everything. Some called it inspiring. Others said, grace under fire. You made an impression. Imani stared at the screen, then set the phone down beside her glass. She didn't feel inspired, she felt hollow. Because being graceful under fire shouldn't be a requirement to be respected. It shouldn't take perfect poise to earn what should have been given freely. Human decency. She closed her journal and leaned her head back, letting her eyes close as the plane leveled off. The low hum of the engine filled the quiet, and in that silence, she let herself feel. Not victorious, not vindicated, but weary. Weary from a world that still needed to be shown over and over what dignity looked like. But even in that weariness, there was a flicker of resolve, because she had shown it, and someone had seen it. The girl in line, the older woman who nodded, the man who watched and said nothing, but would remember. Maybe one day their silence would turn into action. Maybe next time someone else would speak. But until then, Imani Clarke would keep walking into rooms that doubted her and reminding them, quietly and unapologetically, exactly who she was. And that's the kind of power no one can take away. The cabin hummed with a soft, steady quiet, the kind of hush that comes not from silence, but from the muffled calm of high altitude. Imani Clarke sat in seat 1A, her posture relaxed but her mind far from still. Outside her window, clouds stretched beneath the aircraft like soft hills of cotton, the earth long vanished from view. But for Imani, the weight of everything that had happened at the gate hadn't lifted with the plane's ascent. If anything, it pressed more heavily now, settling into the spaces where adrenaline once lived. She pulled her journal from her bag, the old leather-bound one her father had given her on the day she earned her MBA. She ran her fingers over the cover, worn smooth by years of touch. Inside, her thoughts lived in ink, her disappointments, her victories, her truths. She flipped to a fresh page and paused, pen hovering above it. She knew what she wanted to write. She just didn't want to feel it yet. Then from further down the cabin, a voice called out, "Excuse me, my water is warm. Can I get some ice?" A man's voice, sharp, impatient, the kind of voice that didn't ask but expected. Imani glanced up briefly. Row 3, middle-aged, white, dressed in a casual golf shirt and designer slacks. He waved off the flight attendant's polite apology with a dismissive flick of his hand. "It's not complicated," he added, loud enough to make heads turn. Imani watched the young attendant's shoulders tighten as she nodded and hurried toward the galley. Another moment, another woman silenced by someone who assumed he had the right. Imani knew that posture too well, the practiced calm, the smile that masks the sting. She knew it because she wore it daily. She looked back at her journal, and finally the words came. Grace under fire isn't a skill. It's a survival tool. It's how we stand still while being hit, and somehow don't break. She paused again, then underlined the words slowly. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. Grace is strength, and strength is grace. Use both, and the world will bend when it refuses to see you. She had been 11 when he first said it, after a teacher accused her of cheating on a math test because her score was too high for someone like her. She hadn't understood what someone like her meant until later, but her father had. And that day, instead of rage, he gave her a gift, a journal and a lesson. Write down who you are, he told her, because the world will keep trying to tell you who you're not. Today, the world had tried again. She wrote, they assumed I was out of place because I asked, because I didn't raise my voice, because I stood there, black and composed and unbothered by their smirks. They saw all of that and still chose to mock me. That's not ignorance. That's decision. The attendant returned to check on Imani. Mao Shamani, her voice softer this time, more measured. Is there anything else I can bring you, Miss Clarke? She asked gently, eyes kind. Imani looked up and saw the strain behind her smile, the way her hands were clasped just a little too tightly. No, thank you, Imani said with warmth. You're doing just fine. The attendant blinked, then smiled for real this time. A quiet moment passed between them, mutual recognition without a single word about what had transpired back at the gate. And yet it was understood. These things were always understood. The seatbelt light blinked off. People settled into movies, books, sleep. But Imani didn't rest. She turned back to her journal and continued writing. I didn't shout. I didn't demand. I didn't name drop. I didn't need to. That's what unsettled them, my calm, my refusal to justify. My silence made them look at themselves. And they didn't like what they saw. She paused and took a slow breath, the kind you take when you're not sure whether to cry or keep writing. She chose the latter. But her hands trembled slightly, and for once, she didn't hide it. The man in row 3 raised his voice again, this time complaining about the vegetarian meal he had pre-ordered, now unacceptable. The same attendant apologized again, her voice steady. Imani watched her walk away, chin lifted. Grace under fire, Imani thought again. Her gaze drifted to the window. The sky had darkened slightly, streaks of deep blue and fading gold painting the horizon. Dusk at 30,000 feet. There was something comforting about being suspended in that in-between, between sky and earth, between rage and resolve. She wrote, sometimes I wish I didn't have to be graceful. Sometimes I wish I could just be, without carrying the expectations of an entire narrative, without having to constantly represent strength just to be seen as human. The pen stopped moving. She stared at the words, her throat tightening. That was the truth, wasn't it? She was tired, not just today, not just from this incident, but from always having to walk the line between being assertive and being labeled, from constantly managing other people's discomfort with her presence, her confidence, her calm. She didn't want to be inspirational today. She just wanted to rest. She closed the journal slowly, her hand lingering on the cover. She leaned back in the seat, letting her eyes close, the soft whir of the aircraft surrounding her. But even in that brief silence, the emotions pulsed under the surface. Anger, weariness, a flicker of pride, and underneath it all, sadness. Because the truth was, what happened at that counter wasn't new, and it wouldn't be the last time. And every time it happened, it left a mark, not visible, not loud, but a mark just the same. A small, invisible bruise where another piece of trust used to live. And yet, she didn't break. She never broke. And that's what they didn't expect. Because grace is what rises when the world wants to see you fall. And Imani Clarke? She rose. She always did. And as the sky outside the window turned to velvet and stars began to flicker into view, Imani whispered to herself, so soft no one else could hear, "You belong. You are enough. You're still standing." And that was everything. The plane had landed smoothly, the descent gentle, the wheels kissing the tarmac with barely a jolt. But inside Imani Clarke's chest, there was a heaviness that hadn't lifted with the seatbelt light. She walked through the terminal with her signature grace, her carry-on rolling softly behind her, every step measured, composed. But beneath that calm, something deeper stirred. The events at the gate still clung to her. Not the termination itself, not even the apology from Mr. Alvarez, but the weight of what it had taken to remain still while being silently sliced apart by mockery. She had thought the moment ended when the terminal doors slid open and the fresh evening air met her skin. But it hadn't. Not really. Because moments like that never ended where they started. They traveled. They lingered. They took root in others. And sometimes, if the world was paying attention, they bloomed into something more. And it was in that fragile space between exhaustion and reflection, as her car glided toward her hotel, that her phone rang. A number she didn't recognize. She almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. But something inside her said answer. So she did. "Hello?" she said calmly, though her voice was edged with fatigue. There was silence on the other end, a beat too long. Then a voice, quiet, shaken, unfamiliar in its vulnerability. "Ms. Clarke, it's Amanda. From the gate. I hope this isn't inappropriate." The name hit her like a slow-moving wave. Amanda, the woman who had smirked, who had said "you people," who had laughed at her like her question had been a punchline. Imani's fingers tightened ever so slightly on the phone. She didn't respond right away. The silence must have unnerved Amanda because her voice rushed in, panicked and unsteady. "I'm sorry. I had to say something. I know I don't deserve your time, but I needed you to hear it from me. I'm sorry. I was wrong. I was completely wrong." Imani closed her eyes, her back pressed against the cool leather of the car seat. She didn't know what she was feeling. Tension, surprise, a flicker of compassion, maybe all three. Amanda's voice was different now. Gone was the arrogance, the biting humor. What replaced it was raw, broken, real. "I judged you," Amanda whispered. "I saw your coat and your skin and the way you didn't raise your voice, and I decided who you were. I didn't even think. I just reacted like I'd done it 100 times before. And then I saw you stand there and say nothing while I tore you down. And you didn't even flinch. You just waited. You had power, and I didn't see it until it was too late. But the worst part, the part I can't stop thinking about," her voice cracked, "you never tried to humiliate me, even when I deserved it. You didn't gloat, you didn't yell, you didn't break. You showed more dignity in silence than I've ever had in my best moments." Imani listened, still quiet, still waiting. "I can't sleep," Amanda continued, her voice now soaked in guilt. "People are writing about it online, passengers, saying you handled yourself with grace under pressure, that you inspired them, that you changed something. And they're right, you did. I saw myself in that moment for the first time, and I didn't like what I saw. I don't know what happens to me now, I just know I needed to say it. I'm sorry, Ms. Clarke. Truly." Imani finally spoke, her voice low and even. "Thank you for calling." Another pause. "You're not yelling." "I don't need to yell," Imani replied. "You already heard everything that needed to be said." In the silence, Amanda's breath trembled. I did hear it." Imani exhaled slowly, letting the emotion rise and settle like sediment in a still glass. She wasn't here to offer vengeance. That was never what she wanted. What she had always wanted, was change. Not just an apology, but a reckoning. Amanda, she said, her tone firm, but not unkind. Regret is a beginning. But real change isn't what you feel, it's what you do next. Your apology means nothing unless it becomes action. You need to examine what led you to that moment, not just the moment itself. Amanda was quiet. Then, I will. I swear I will. Imani nodded, even though she knew Amanda couldn't see it. Then let this be your starting point, not your excuse. The call ended softly the way a door closes, not slammed but gently shut, with finality and care. Imani sat back, her phone resting on her lap, her gaze drifting to the city lights outside the car window. Her reflection stared back at her, ghostly against the glass. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt human and deeply, deeply tired. She thought of the passengers who had quietly clapped, of the woman in line who had nodded with solemn approval, of the man who had watched the entire thing unfold with awakened eyes. She hadn't just corrected a wrong. She'd created a moment people remembered, and they were remembering. She'd seen the articles already trickling out, the posts online, the woman in blue who stood her ground. First class, but make it fearless. Grace has a name, Imani Clarke. She hadn't asked for any of that, but if it meant that someone somewhere thought twice before sneering at a stranger who didn't fit their image of belonging, then maybe, just maybe, the moment had become something larger than pain. A ripple, a wave, a beginning. She opened her journal again, her pen moving with less hesitation now. Amanda called. She cried. She owned it. I didn't give her forgiveness. I gave her truth. Because we can't keep cushioning people from the weight of their own behavior. But I left the door open. I always will. Because maybe someday she'll walk through it with a different heart. She closed the book and looked out at the stars above the city skyline. No matter how far she climbed, the battle was always there. But so was she. And tonight she had turned a moment of mockery into a mirror. And that was what waves were made of. Later that same day, the golden sun spilled through the towering windows of a sleek, modern conference room on the 47th floor of a downtown skyscraper. Floor-to-ceiling glass framed the horizon like a masterpiece, the city stretching endlessly beyond it. Inside, a long, polished table gleamed under the soft light, surrounded by some of the most powerful figures in the aviation industry, executives, board members, and policy leaders. At the head of the table stood Imani Clarke, poised, radiant, and unshaken, her calm presence commanding the room without a single raised voice. She had changed clothes since the flight, now dressed in a graceful ivory blouse and navy slacks. But the quiet fire in her eyes hadn't dimmed. If anything, it had only grown. The board members had all heard about what happened at the airport. The whispers had made their way into headlines, and the passengers' testimonials had gone viral. They knew she hadn't made a scene. She hadn't needed to. She had made a statement, and her silence had spoken louder than 1,000 angry words. Now, standing in front of them, she wasn't asking for sympathy. She was offering leadership. Real leadership. The kind grounded in integrity, in empathy, and in vision. Today, Shibirteman, her voice strong and smooth, is not about punishing the past. It's about transforming the future. What happened at that airport was not unique. It wasn't surprising. And that's the problem. The room was silent, hanging on her every word. Bias, especially the kind that hides beneath courtesy, lives in our systems, in our language, in our assumptions. If we want to lead in this industry, we can't just respond to these moments. We have to root them out. One executive shifted, nodding solemnly. Another leaned forward, eyes sharpened with curiosity and quiet respect. I'm proposing a new standard, Imani continued, a cultural retraining initiative that starts not with punishment, but with awareness, one that highlights not only what not to do, but what to do. Because dignity, service, and respect shouldn't depend on who's asking for it. It should be the baseline, period. Her words didn't just land, they planted seeds. You could see it in the expressions around the table. And as she concluded her short presentation with clear action steps, policy revisions, passenger feedback audits, new frontline leadership coaching, there wasn't a single dissenting voice. What she'd faced had hurt her. It had exhausted her. But she'd turned it into purpose. not because she needed to prove herself, but because she knew someone else would walk that same airport path after her, and she wanted it to be different. When the meeting ended, applause rose. Not polite, not obligatory, genuine, respectful, admiring. One of the younger board members, a woman barely in her 30s, approached her privately. "Ms. Clarke," she said quietly, "I watched that video. I cried. I've been in rooms like that. Airports, offices, elevators, and I've never seen someone handle it the way you did." Imani smiled softly. "You don't have to shout to be heard, and you don't have to fight every time. Sometimes just standing still is enough to shake the walls." The woman nodded, misty-eyed. "You shook mine." Later that evening, Imani stood in her hotel suite looking out over the skyline. The city sparkled like it was holding its breath, every light a silent witness to the day's journey. She was no stranger to boardrooms, nor to bias, but today had felt different. Not because she'd won, but because she'd shown that you can face indignity with grace and still hold others accountable. You can change minds without losing your voice. She thought of the girl at the gate, clutching her mother's hand. She thought of Amanda's voice on the phone, filled with shame and maybe, just maybe, the seeds of change. She thought of every passenger who watched and whispered afterward, "That could have been me." And she thought of herself, not the executive, not the title, but the woman who had stood alone at that counter, mocked for daring to ask, and who hadn't let the world define her by that moment. She picked up her journal one last time and wrote the words that had lived inside her chest all day. "Power isn't what you say, it's what you hold. And when you hold it with grace, people remember. You remember not just what you did, but how you made them see themselves differently." And that's what this story is all about. Not revenge, not anger, but visibility, grace, strength, and the quiet courage it takes to carry yourself with dignity when the world assumes you don't belong. Imani didn't just prove herself today. She set a new standard. Not for herself, but for everyone watching. And now, as we bring this story to a close, let's take a moment to reflect. How many times have you seen someone judged before they even spoke? How many times have you been underestimated because of how you look, how you speak, where you stand? Let Imani's story be a reminder. You don't need to raise your voice to raise a standard. You don't need to shout to be powerful. And when the world underestimates you, stand tall anyway. Because your calm can shake rooms. Your grace can shift culture. Your strength, when held quietly, can ripple into waves of real change. So if this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone, or maybe reminded you of yourself, please like this video to show your support for Imani's strength. Leave a comment below about a time you stood your ground or witnessed someone else rise with grace. Your voice matters here. And if you want to hear more real, powerful stories like this, stories of resilience, of justice, of quiet strength turning the tide, make sure to hit that subscribe button and tap the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Every share, every like, every subscription helps us bring these stories to more people who need to hear them. Because someone out there might be Imani tomorrow, and they deserve to know they're not alone.